Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to speak today. If I can just acknowledge my co-authors first of all, James Allen, who I think has now left the meeting but might come back on, Paul Williams and Gordon McFiggins. This is some work that is very much ongoing, so I'm just going to provide a quick snapshot of where we're up to with it today. So, as we all know, the fine particulate component of air pollution has an impact on human health. And increasingly, people are looking towards the issue of wood burning as a source of particulates in general in the urban atmosphere. But more recently on indoor PM, there was a study that was published earlier this year that had some quite dramatic headlines saying that the indoor particulate in terms of PM 2.5 was 200% higher with burning stoves. And obviously this alarmed many people. So we were concerned to see exactly what that was all about, and whether we could also see how these particulates were being led into the room. So we're looking at the PM10 and the PM 2.5 concentrations, and we are comparing an older stove, so a 10-year-old stove, with a modern eco-design compliant stove. Just to mention eco-design, this is a regulation that's come in Europe-wide, so obviously covering the UK, to say that that manufacturers are no longer able to sell high emitting or inefficient stoves, and so we know that the technology improvements have reduced flue emissions, but the question is, has that corresponded to reduced indoor emissions as well? The wood stove use in the UK is quite high. They've been seen as something that's quite aspirational for a number of years. Typically, they're used for supplementary heating, so people like to sit in front of a wood burner in the evenings and weekends. More recently, people are finding themselves at home a lot more. So there's some evidence that actually that they're being used a bit more. So we can see from this forecast here that the amount of wood burners have increased since 2010 quite a lot, and expected to still increase further. And I won't dwell on this, but as we know, the PM10 are the respirable fraction of the particulates, and the PM 2.5s are the bits that go really deep into our lungs and are likely to cause health issues. And there's a quote from the World Health Organization that says there's no evidence of a safe level of exposure or a threshold below which no adverse health effects occur. So quite a sobering statement to have in mind while we're looking at these types of issues. To put it into context, though, if we look at these maps, the first one from 1981 to 1990 up to the most recent one up to 2020, we see that in developed countries, in Europe in particular, in the UK, the amount of premature deaths attributed to solid fuels, indoor air pollution, is much lower than it used to be, and it's at a much lower level than we are seeing in developing world, particularly Asia. And this is because we're using completely different technology stoves. We're not having open fires. We're not having three-stone fires for cooking and heating. We have enclosed stoves, generally speaking, with a flue, so the emissions are going to the air rather than to the indoor. So moving on to what we've actually been doing, the two stoves that we've investigated so far have been a Morso Badger, which is the 10-year-old model. Now, Morso have got an improved version of this as well, which is eco-design compliant, but this is actually the original version that we're looking at, compared to a more modern SE bake heart stove, and this is eco-design compliant. We're looking at them in real world operation. The Morso is actually in a domestic residence, and the bake heart was tested in the showroom. We're looking at the ignition phase, reloading of the wood, and the cleaning of the ash, which is something that wouldn't be done on a daily basis. It's typically done once or twice a week, depending on how often the stove is used. We compared it with some cooking processes. So things like a cooked breakfast, which could include cooking bacon and fried eggs and so on, toasting bread. These processes were done with an extractor fan. We also compared to using a perfume candle, an incense stick, or puffs of hairspray, and these were all in the same location as the wood stove. The cooking process was in a different room, but it was about the same volume in terms of the kitchen size compared to the other room. We're using some fairly basic analyzers, I guess we can say here. So we're using the workhorse TSI OPS model 3330, which is a very nice portable spectrometer. And we compared it with a fairly new low-cost Blue Sky air quality monitor. Now, these are sold for less than $400, so about £350. And both of these devices are suitable for use either indoors or outdoors. The Blue Sky is quite nice because it's just logs data automatically via Wi-Fi, so they're used just as a sort of monitor. Moving on to our results. Now, what we found, these are just the results as given from the analyzers. So we've not tried to put any additional calibrations in here. And we'll come back to that as a limitation later. But when we looked at our peak values and our average values over the course of the test, we actually didn't see a lot of difference in the performance of the old stove and the new stove in terms of the PM10 and PM2.5. We found that actually they were comparable to lighting a single candle, a perfume candle, or a stick of incense. Now, this result is based on a fairly short time frame. If we were to continue to burn incense in a room compared to continuing reloading the stove, we'd expect that perhaps the incense would lead to an increase of particulate over time because it's not vented. Obviously, the stoves have got a flue, so they're vented. And we also found that actually most of our cooking activities were hugely over the values that we were having from the other sources of emissions. This was quite concerning. This result here is a typical value for cooking a fried breakfast. This isn't actually the highest value that we found. We had some results from cooking sausages that were twice this in terms of the magnitude of the particulates. I didn't include those because it was so difficult to see the rest of the values in that case. But it was quite interesting to see this split. What we did find, though, is that the ash removal process, just using a basic brush and shovel, did cause a peak of particulates in the room. But this was just a particulate PM10 of almost 500 micrograms, that should be per meter cubed. This is something that you would do as a one-off, as I said, once or twice a week. So it's something that we're going to come back to in terms of estimating the contribution over the course of a week or a 2-week average. Looking at the results on a time basis, so the old stove, as I say, was quite similar in its results to the new stove. And if we look at the split between the PM10 and the PM2.5, we can clearly see that we have the peak emission corresponding to the ignition phase. Obviously, we've got the front of the stove open quite a lot at this point just to get ignition started. And then we see some additional peaks during the reloading of the wood. And this is corresponding to a waft of smoke coming out of the front of the stoves as the door is opened. We were a little bit surprised that we didn't see the same relationship with the PM2.5. We would expect that to track that value. And we would also expect perhaps that a bigger proportion of the PM10 would be the PM2.5. So this also indicates that perhaps this isn't all combustion related. It could be that there's some degree of dust disturbance and resuspension just during the activity of reloading the stove. But as I say, these are initial results, so there's a lot more to investigate here. The maximum concentration is reasonably high though at ignition, but this is only for a fairly short phase. And then we're finding that the overall concentration in the room is returning to levels that are comparable to the background, sorry, for most of this test. Now, we would actually expect that the draft effect from the stove should pull air through into the room from the sort of outdoors and into the stove. So this does make some sort of sense. And if we compare direct flue sampling that we've previously discussed, this is using a DMS, we know that we do have this very high emission at the cold start lighting of the stove when everything's cold and we don't have any natural draft established. And then the particulates that are emitted from the combustion calm down into the flaming phase and the smouldering phase. Comparing the size distributions for the different sources, again, quite interesting. This is on a mass basis, quite interesting that we're getting very similar results for the candle, the incense and the stove, but we're getting quite a different level of emission from the cooking, and this is because of the condensed organics that we're getting. So we're getting a lot of fats, carboxylic acid, and all sorts of things that are evaporating and pyrolyzing from the foods, particularly meats, or particularly when we're frying, and this is what's causing the high emissions. I said at the beginning we were looking at our results in comparison to a blue sky monitor. We didn't actually get a particularly good match between the results. To be fair though, we haven't put any calibration into this yet, and the blue sky does give an opportunity to put a calibration in if you are looking at particular sources. The interface for the blue sky is quite nice though, and we find that it was very good at detecting that there was an event happening, even if the actual quantification wasn't really in line with what we were seeing on the OPS. This is something that, again, we need to do some more work on. So limitations, well, we're still doing the project, so further analysis is required. We need to really get a handle on these optical techniques compared to what we would get against gravimetric methods, for instance. I believe it was Anna earlier spoke about the underestimation of concentration and of size that we get with techniques, optical techniques. And also, if we look at our work compared to some earlier work by Ward and Noonan, they showed that if you look at stoves in different locations, you get vastly different results recorded as well. And some of this is down to user behavior. So we need to look at all this. But conclusions to date are that some of the typical activities that a householder would do, such as cooking a single slice of toast or lighting a candle, tend to result in similar mass concentrations of particulates to the measured values that we had. That the two stoves had similar results, so we didn't see a significant difference with the new stove compared to the older stove, but that's with the caveat that we've only looked at the two stoves so far. However, the ash removal step did seem to cause quite a high level of PM, and it would be recommended that this operation should probably use an ash vacuum rather than a brush and shovel, and that there should be venting of the room, so opening of windows during and after this step. And that the cooking, particularly including frying or grilling meat, led to particularly high particulates, especially towards the smallest particles, and this is according to the condensed organics. If I can just thank EPSRC and also SE Engineering, certainly Wood for providing us some wood, and the Stove Industry Alliance. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Really interesting. There's a couple of questions. Martin asks, and I had a similar question actually. How close together were the OPC and Blue Sky? Same inlet or just in each other's vicinity?
They were in each other's vicinity, but they were about a meter apart. I mean, the OPC has a pump, so it's drawing in the air, whereas the Blue Sky is more of a passive that's just using a laser to look through the air. This is something that we'll probably try to try some different permutations, I guess, of where the optimum position to put the analyzers is, because one of the other factors that we were concerned about is that if you're having combustion source emissions, they're hot, so they're volatile. So we were trying to do our sampling at a tabletop height that would represent the height of somebody sitting down, whereas we think that perhaps sometimes we were missing some of the emissions because they were just going up to the ceiling. And perhaps if we have sampling in different positions with both of the analyzers, we might start to see a variation in the results that we're getting.
On a similar note to that, then from the particle sources, are they a similar distance then to the sensors? Is that consistent throughout?
Yeah, so we had the candle and the incense stick on the hearth just in front of the stove. Obviously, they were done on different days so that we could get a clean background between each. The only difference sites were when we did the kitchen cooking tests, but other than that, and obviously the second stove was also in a different location because that was at SE's showroom, so that was a bit different, but we tried to keep the distances as similar as we could.
Great. So Peter asks, have there been any comparison studies with the TSI Blue Sky? Otherwise, could you give an idea of how well they perform?
This isn't, no, I haven't seen any others so far. I think it's a fairly new unit. We only bought it maybe 6 months ago or something like that. And yeah, from the literature review that I've done so far, I haven't seen anything. And I think that it does seem like a nice instrument. There's a lot of interest at the moment in people having their own personal monitors. So you can buy monitors off of Amazon, for instance, for a couple of £100 or less. And what I have seen is that there's some literature reviews starting to come in that is reviewing the performance of a lot of these lower cost monitors. And they do have a lot of variation according to what type of particulates they're looking for. So this is something else that we're really interested in.
Yeah, great. The next one is from Matt, and I also was interested in this as well. Are there hints from chemical composition or studies which indicate the relative toxicity of wood smoke versus other sources such as cooking, traffic, etc.?
There have been a few studies. There was a fairly large study done by Public Health England, and I forget the name of the lead author. I think it began with a G, and they reviewed all of the studies worldwide that they could find, all the data they could find worldwide, and they came to a conclusion that that really there's not enough consistency in the way that studies have been done to really have a firm grip on whether there's an issue with wood burning stoves or not in terms of the health effects. But they said that there isn't evidence there, and that doesn't mean that there's not an issue. It just means that the evidence isn't there yet. So really the conclusions from most of the reports in the literature are that there's not enough work done on this. People have looked at individual components. So they've looked at, for instance, PAH to see whether they're at significant limits, and that study, again, I can't remember the author, has concluded that they're below detection limits normally in the ambient air from a wood burner. And people have looked at other aromatics as well. And again, that so far the levels are low, but they are measurable for a number of the volatile organic carbons as well. So the jury's out, I'd say.
Great, thanks so much. There's actually a few more in there. I'm going to let you take those offline and pop the answers into the Zoom chat.